More. 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 Everybody wants more. Your boss wants more. His boss wants more. The CEO wants more. The board wants more. The shareholders, they want more as well. If you're in the public sector, the citizens want more, of course. So does the minister, so does the government, so does your departmental boss. Your suppliers, they want more as well. And their suppliers, they want more. And so do their suppliers. And so do the people who work for them. And so do the staff, the people who work for you. They want more as well. And so do their families at home. And breaking news, everybody. You want more. Everybody wants more. And that singular fact has, more than anything else, has driven the rise and rise of procurement as a profession this last couple of decades, really. And we promised the trends in procurement this last 10 or 20 or 30 years, and there they are. All on one slide at one time, very easy. So, get the price down, and then get the cost down, of course, became the mantra. And we hired people to do that, to do our professional shopping for us in large organisations, in large government departments. And we went to low-cost countries to find those cheap goods. And they're evaporating now. And then we evolved, and we started to manage risk and find that the greatest cost in business, and the GFC taught us this, is risk and the failure to manage it. And we employ better process and systems to help us do that. And we start managing categories quite specifically and become specialists, supply experts in those categories, FM services being one of the quintessential 14 categories of indirect expenditure that every procurement manager has to manage at some point in their career. And finally, where we are today, where we're focused not just on price, not just on cost, not just on risk, but on better outcomes and better commercial outcomes, and what they look like for our organisation, specifically here and now and today, but in the future as well. And most procurement departments, if not all, I think, have either been through a transformation process or going through one or just about to start. And where it ends up is you learn that building relationships with your suppliers and relationships with your supply chain, SRM, supplier relationship management, is the key to a new world of value for good, proactive, professional, strategic procurement. And I'll come back to that before we're finished. So there's the rise and rise of professional procurement for the last 30 years. Presentation over. We don't need to do any more, do we? Brief fulfilled. Except that's the past. And it's not so interesting. What's much more interesting is the future. So I want to take a little glimpse of where these trends might take us, perhaps in the future. And what every procurement department has been wrestling with is this maturity curve. And every procurement person I've spoken to in the last 30 years, thanks for that, Cassandra, 30 years in business next month, has travelled this journey from assuring supply, the first responsibility of a professional buyer, make sure it turns up in the right place at the right time, at the right place, at the right spec, for the right people, the 5 rights, to getting the price down. And after a while you realise, hang on a minute, it's not really about price, is it? It's about cost, whole life cost, lifetime cost, the full cost here, the consequential cost of our decisions and what we're doing. And then we realise, as I just said, proactive risk management is really driving down those big costs that can hit us unexpectedly. Where this journey takes you is to value. I want to leave you with a question today, and I'll answer it before we finish. What is value? What does value look like for your organisation today, and what does it look like for your organisation in future? That's the big question. I'll argue to you, it's about goal alignment. It's about aligning the output of what you're doing with what your company is trying to do, your department if you're in the public service, the mission and goals, the purpose of your organisation. Just because we know this exists, we can't leap there tomorrow. Just because I can describe what utopia looks like doesn't mean we can all move there tomorrow. We've got to go through the journey. Our job as professionals on the supply side of business is to get there faster, with less fuss and less cost and less risk. Better, faster, cheaper, greener, safer, if you will. So, getting through this maturity curve has become the challenge of procurement these last few years. And when I go and speak to procurement people in the first 5 minutes, they're busy telling me, of course, they're right at the top, world class, you know, here. And after half an hour's conversation and a few tricky questions, actually we're not really there. There aren't many procurement teams who are at the top of that curve. There's a few, handful. Most people are somewhere on the curve still. So what does it look like in property and FM services? Well, I wouldn't presume to tell this audience all about that. But it seems fairly obvious to me that if the first responsibility of a professional buyer is assuring supply, that looks like building availability. Cutting prices, if you like. It certainly looks like rent reductions for tenants, doesn't it? Perhaps not. Reducing the total cost of building ownership seems like a sensible goal on the FM side of business management, and mitigating the risks that come with that. Procurement Leaders is a global intelligence network for the procurement profession, and they tell us that typically FM services, would you believe, is the second largest overhead for many companies. Some of the risks we face on the supply side of building management are fairly obvious. Some are less obvious, but I wouldn't presume to tell you, and some are new. And it's the new ones I want to focus on a little bit. So the obvious risks I don't need to tell you about. The less obvious risks I probably don't need to tell you about. And if you're unfortunate, you have to end up managing some of these things. But there's a new strata of risk, socially responsible risk, that's bigger, broader than just sustainability. And in the sustainability movement, on the green side of things nowadays, people talk about sustainability in its broadest sense of the word. It doesn't just mean green anymore. It's become interchangeable with CSR, corporate social responsibility. And the things we're reading about in the press every day that turn out to be true, that are happening everywhere to everybody. What these things are doing is risking the brand's reputation. And that ultimately can be the greatest cost for an organisation, even in the public sector sometimes. And that's really the greatest cost we face unless we're careful. So increasingly, managing corporate social responsibility on the supply side is about managing risk and brand reputation. And in order to mitigate that risk and manage that risk, many people are looking for a license to operate. A license from their stakeholders, from their neighbours, from the consumers, from the public, from the government, from a wide range of stakeholders, the broadest sense of stakeholders to an organisation. I need a license to operate here. Many of the resource companies are at the forefront of this, of course. The coal companies in New South Wales are struggling to win a license to operate from their neighbours because of the consequences of their operations. So that's the most obvious example that you can think of your own now, where people need a license to operate. And the best thought leadership on the CSR side of things at the moment is talking about the license to operate as an essential business asset in future. And that thinking is right in the middle of the procurement profession now. In fact, I argue, and I'll argue to you today, it has the potential to change the fabric of our decision making in corporate life, in professional procurement. For 80 years, procurement has been driven by the ideal of value for money. But procurement's an instrument of policy. So what's your policy? Until now, value for money. In future, perhaps not. Perhaps a license to operate from all of our stakeholders, not just the most obvious. So all of these things actually fall under the CSR mandate. All of these things can create a true total cost of ownership, unless we're careful, unless we're proactively managing that risk. Georgia Tech is a well-known university in the US that did a major piece of work in 2005 on supply chain shocks. Now, this wasn't just things not turning up. This was big drama, product recalls, and failure. They looked at 300 firms all listed on Wall Street, and they calculated the true cost of those supply chain shocks. And the cost wasn't the cost of the recall. It wasn't the cost of any restocking, of compensation, of PR, of extra marketing. It was actually the cost beholden to the organisation from the drop in the share price, which on average dropped 20% and stayed down for over 2 years before it recovered. So the true cost, the whole life cost, if you like, of those shocks in those supply chains to those organisations was massive, in the billions. And that's where you end up if you're not managing brand reputation proactively in the supply chain. So this whole question of corporate social responsibility is now informing the decision matrix of the most proactive procurement teams. And as I said to you at the start, many of them are buying FM services on behalf of their organisation. And this is why CSR has really come to the forefront again. So this example where 1,129 people died was perhaps one of the most dramatic examples of supply chain shock. And it manifested itself most in England, actually, where the English consumer awoke to the dangers of CSR and reacted. It changed consumer expectations because this factory was supplying Poundland, which is a fairly new phenomenon in the UK. Here we've got $2 shops, and they're a tradition and a long-standing, but not so in England. Buying a garment for £1? Very successful organisation in only the last few years, really, since the GFC, and it's fairly obvious why. But people walking down the high street of the shops with a bag branded Poundland were starting to be abused in the street. So people were accusing shoppers of creating this by buying a garment for £1. And then it came out, of course, that actually a premium retailer, Marks & Spencer's, also used the same factory, except they were charging a bit more than £1, a lot more than £1 for a garment. And the British consumer reacted. Poundland shares plummeted. There was a huge PR issue in the UK. And all of a sudden, it looked like Poundland wouldn't survive. They did, but only just. But shoppers were hiding their shopping bags, stuffing them in bins as they walked down the street and putting the garments on. So they weren't being abused or have a nasty glances their way. Consumer expectations had just changed, like they did in Australia not so long ago, when Sharon had just ordered 400,000 footballs for Auskick, only to find out that they'd been paying little boys in India 12 cents an hour to make those footballs. And all of a sudden, it looked like a 100-year-old brand wouldn't survive the week. I was aghast at this one because I've been telling the case study of Nike in 1999 in Vietnam, who of course got a much better deal than Sharon. They were only paying 7 cents a football. And I've been telling that story since 1999. And people in procurement know that story. So for them to to copy exactly the same story and fall into exactly the same trap, for me, was just mind-blowing. Child labour exploitation is one of the most obvious dangers in the supply chain today. There's more. In America, the American consumer has woken up to the Foxconn problem. Foxconn's a city in China and Guangdong province. There's 5.5 million people just live in that one city, and they all work for Foxconn, and they all make iPhones. And if you've got an iPhone in your pocket, and they are accused of worker exploitation. Apple went to see Nike to have a chat about why it mattered, this supply chain thing that seems to be an issue for everybody. Why is that a problem? Tim Cook actually asked Nike what was a problem. Amazing that that level of ignorance still exists. Absolutely astonishing. Zara. Ladies, anyone buy your goods here? They found 26 slaves at their principal supplier. This wasn't way down the supply chain. This was their number one, tier one supplier where 90% of their garments are made. They had 26 slaves out the back making those garments. Zara, horrified, couldn't believe it, went into full PR mode. But the Spanish consumer, Zara's headquartered in Spain, the factory's in Brazil. And the Latino world, if you like, went into meltdown, and the consumer in the Latino world suddenly changed their expectations. And then in April 2013, it happened again. Zara protested all innocence, except this time most people felt they protested too much. In New Zealand, the baby powder distributed by Fonterra has changed consumer expectations in New Zealand profoundly and overnight. In the US again, Mattel. All that happened globally. I had to rip Barbie doll out of my daughter's hands. I was the evil daddy for taking it that way, because it was covered in lead paint. Who'd have thought in 2007? So what's been happening is these examples in different countries around the world have been forces for change. And there's 4 groups that have really driven that change and are driving it today and now in the future. I'd like to give you an example from each. Stakeholders we've already covered. Consumers want conscionable choices. And certainly where prices are even, they want to be seen to buy a conscionable choice. The real question is, how much more are consumers prepared to pay for a clean and conscionable choice? And increasingly, the answer is more. Shareholders in major companies at AGMs have been saying we're prepared to pay more, to give up a little of the share price for a cleaner conscience. So increasingly, that's the big question. How much are people prepared to pay, ultimately, to choose the right choice rather than the wrong one, as it's presented to them? Governments, of course, are concerned on behalf of the consumer and increasingly mandating compliance to new laws, rules, regulations that force corporate social responsibility. And pressure groups, of course, demanding change have become more high profile. And what these different organisations have is a different perspective on what value constitutes for them. So we've already covered this. I should mention, of course, fraud and corruption, which is an increasing issue around the world. And I'll come back to that before we finish. But it's interesting to note that Australia is only 11th on the Global Index of Corruption on transparency.org, which is great fun if you've got a few minutes to surf that list. And some of our trading partners are some way down the list. I saw a very powerful presentation from Deloitte recently, and they've done some major research globally that insists that 1 in 4 supply chains is riddled with corruption. And the presentation concludes with, a quarter of you here have a supply chain riddled with corruption. You just don't know. That was very confronting, but that's what the research says. I'm sure nobody here does, but a Deloitte assert there is. But there's some fun one lunchtime for you, transparency.org. What consumers are really concerned about, though, is provenance. Where things came from and how they got here. Child labour being one example. But really it's broader, deeper than wider than that. It's who is supplying you? Who is supplying them? Who is supplying them? How do you know? What are you getting? Are you getting what you purchased? How do you know? And the word that keeps coming up in that scenario is trust, which has been at the heart of the buy-sell relationship for thousands of years. Trust. Sure, you can test, but who pays? Do you test everything? It's expensive and time-consuming. Ultimately, it comes down to trust. But this is increasingly what consumers want to know. And they are ultimately the ones pressuring government, shareholders, stakeholders, to make change happen. And governments, as we know, have many ways of getting us to do what they want us to do. In other words, to fulfill their policy. Procurement is just an instrument of policy. So what's the policy? So we've got all the laws, regulations, tax. Only this morning I was driving in listening to the radio and they were talking about profit shifting and tax across country boundaries for major corporations. And I've been at the heart of that issue in my career at some point. And the transfer prices that a producer charges its own company in a different country to minimise margin and therefore tax is prevalent. Free trade agreements and tariffs we'll come on to in a second, and the World Trade Organization government procurement agreement, we'll come on to that in a minute as well. So for the public sector, those mandates, red tape if you like, is getting tighter and closer to their decision-making process. So particularly in federal government landscape, and these things apply to federal government buyers, but don't be fooled, their influence and their thought leadership and their policy direction is informing buyers at all levels of government and indeed having some influence on the private sector as well. The Commonwealth procurement rules until the actually 30th of June 2012 were called the Commonwealth Procurement Guidelines. And at 5:30 on a Friday night, actually the night before carbon tax was announced, they became the Commonwealth Procurement Rules. The new government, the current government, have proclaimed that they are going to review all of the Commonwealth procurement rules and decree how they should be in future. That review is ongoing. There's been several Senate committees, and only last week the First Secretary of the Department of Finance and Services in Canberra announced that they'd be ready soon. He's been saying that for nearly a year. But if you want to have a chat with him, John Sheridan, he has his own blog on here, which is his way of keeping in touch with his constituency, and he invites people to have their say on the Commonwealth procurement rules and what they should say. So enjoy yourselves. Everybody else is in the procurement profession making suggestions of what the Commonwealth procurement rules should be. What many people overlook in that is, of course, they're an instrument of policy. What's the policy? Well, interestingly, the procurement-connected policies were also invented by the previous administration. There were 25. For procurement people, what was so interesting about the PCPs was that so many of them were mutually exclusive. It made being a junior procurement officer a very difficult job indeed in the public service. Which do you buy? The best, the cheapest, the fastest, the cleanest, the greenest? Do you buy the one that's got the best disabled access? That was a PCP. The one with the most women on the board. The one nearest your office within 25 kilometres. In New South Wales, they had a rule that said they'd give a 20% premium in price to suppliers within 25 kilometres of the town hall steps. But they also had a policy saying they'd buy internationally the most competitive. Suddenly, it's getting very complex and difficult to make a purchase decision when you've got 25 policies. Who gets the order this week? We'll spin the roulette wheel and find out. What an impossible job it became to be a procurement officer. Fairly junior level in government, trying to decide which policy was the most important. Impossibly difficult. That doesn't happen now. The government at the moment have announced a review of all 25. They did that when they came into office, and they're slowly making their way around them. And if you go to that URL today, you'll find the current draft, and you'll see how they change as we go forward. What was really interesting was this little rascal that started on the 1st of July. The Indigenous Procurement Policy, the first major policy review of PCPs, and a clear direction from the new government. So it came into being on the 1st of July, and what was really interesting, the history is it came from the Forest Review, which was a year ago today almost, when that was published, the Andrew Forest Review on Indigenous opportunities. The Prime Minister's Closing the Gap report was March 2015, which hinted at potential future direction on Indigenous policy. But what's really interesting here is that within 3 years, government departments are expected to spend 3% of their external spend with suppliers that are indigenously owned and operated. Now that sounds very ambitious. 3% of $35 billion, which is the indirect spend of the federal government, is an awful lot of money. But here's the thing, I'm going to mention Supply Nation in a minute. They used to be called AMC, the Australian Indigenous Minority Supplier Council. Well, they've been going around the ASX getting CEOs to sign pledges that they'd spend up to 5% of their spend with Indigenous-owned suppliers. So the procurement profession are being reacquainted with the laws of supply and demand. There aren't enough suppliers. Now, you've all done O-level economics, GCSE economics or VCE economics. So what happens when supply is insufficient and demand is high? The price goes up. There's going to be a real bun fight for Indigenous-owned suppliers in future. So there's a real opportunity there in many ways. And Supply Nation is the new name for AMC, and they've been right at the forefront of this and defining what good Indigenous supply looks like, and those terms are included within these regulations. And they're fully endorsed, of course, by Supply Nation and were developed in partnership with Supply Nation, an increasingly powerful organisation. And to give you a clue, they formed an alliance with the Afro-American Association in the US, who are teaching them an awful lot very quickly about positive discrimination. So that's coming straight from there. And of course, it was interesting, was it not, that the Prime Minister himself was behind, reputedly, behind this policy so vehemently. And this policy was a surprise for most people who are students of the PCPs, who are pretty boring people, I've got to admit, studying the PCPs morning, noon and night. But it went in the direction opposite to what people expected. People expected a dilution of the PCPs under this government, and in this case, the opposite happened. perhaps a reflection of the PM's passion himself, and certainly Andrew Forrest's passion, since he's been regularly on the phone with President Obama, the Pope, and anyone else of great influence in the world, discussing modern slavery and, here in Australia, Indigenous opportunity. So this is a key development. And in the procurement side of things, if you held me down and insisted, I'd confess to you, this is the biggest single issue that's coming up in procurement for procurement people to manage. Over 60 of the ASX major companies have made a pledge to supply nation. So many companies and many all federal government departments now and many other government entities will be chasing the Indigenous dollar, and it'll become a huge issue for procurement how they manage that, and not just about price, it's about supply, assuring supply, managing price, managing total cost, reducing risk and creating value. That's really the issue. There's other aspects of the ways governments mandate, and here's some other examples. The free trade agreements we've always had with the USA and Thailand, and New Zealand of course, but what people don't appreciate is Section 17 of the USA Free Trade Agreement has massive implications for procurement and mandates public federal procurement here to go through flaming hoops in terms of giving opportunities to American suppliers. And some cynics have pointed to the change in the balance of trade since the United States Free Trade Agreement was signed some years ago. But the 40 you all know about Japan, South Korea and China, it remains to be seen where the small print takes us on government procurement mandates for public buyers. But the GPA, which is the government procurement's the government's agreement on procurement, the government's procurement agreement under the World Trade Organization, also mandates the ways in which public buyers should let contracts across borders. And increasingly, our junior procurement manager has these manuals stacked on their desk as they go through yet more red tape. The current initiative, the Belcher report, is about reducing red tape, although there's some cynicism about that. A blogger, a nasty blogger of course, pointed out that actually, and it's a former secretary within the public service in Canberra who blogs, pointed out that actually it wasn't red tape that was the issue, but the culture. So much of the red tape, they argue, is generated by rumour and the buffer between what the rule actually says. And if you read the Commonwealth procurement rules, well, they're not too bad when you read them, but people don't. Of course, they allow a buffer between what the rule says and the reality of the practice. So these myths develop. You're not allowed to talk to suppliers. It doesn't say that in the Commonwealth procurement rules, but people will tell you with great passion you're not allowed to talk to suppliers. You have to go to tender for everything. It doesn't say that in the CPRs at all. People think it does. So it's not so much about the red tape, it's about breaking down of the culture of what you're allowed to do. That's the real challenge, according to our blogger, who might be nearer the truth than we all care to admit. The UK's been very interesting because they've got two major initiatives, most recently the Modern Slavery Act, so I'll point you at that, and we're not here to consider what the UK's doing, but they're doing more than most in responding to Twiggy's call for abolishing modern slavery. Of course, 9 slaves were freed only a few months ago in Hampshire, which is Britain's equivalent of Toorak. Who'd have thought 9 slaves freed by the Hampshire Constabulary? Amazing, you'd never believe it. If you Google it, it's all there on your phone right now. The Bribery Act is an initiative that sounds almost American because it includes rendition, almost. It certainly includes the right to challenge people overseas who work for a British company or a British-owned company or a British-operated company who are guilty or alleged of any form of corruption or bribery. So the idea that you can be extradited back to the UK is enshrined in UK law. Whether they can do it or not, and whether it happens in practice, is another question. But everyone in procurement is wide awake on the UK Bribery Act now, if the UK features in your supply chain at all. And of course, as the officials at FIFA found out in Switzerland, America's acts that follow a similar path have a greater reach than most. I want to focus just on the UN Global Compact for a moment because that's profoundly important. Obviously, United Nations, you all know, Their Global Compact is a body that encourages business to adopt CSR policies. It's the largest body of its type in the world, as you'd expect. 8,500 companies have signed up to it. That's 8,500 CEOs. And of course, all the usual suspects are right at the top, your Microsofts and your Hewlett-Packards and General Motors and these people, of course. But actually, 8,500 is an awful lot of companies. And there's some unlikely suspects in there. Over half the ASX have signed a commitment to support the UN Global Compact. So what is it? They've got an office in Sydney, by the way, and here in Melbourne, the UN Global Compact, because many Australian businesses have signed to support it. Now, I cut this straight out of Wikipedia, and it's also on the UN Global Compact site, .org there, the URL's there. So you can see how genuine it is. And I did that for a reason. A lot of procurement people are right-clicking on this on the website and copying and pasting it into contracts. And what they're doing is mitigating risk. And what they're saying to suppliers is, you'll do all this, won't you? And you'll manage the supply chain for us, won't you? Make sure your suppliers do us, and their supplier, you get that sorted as well. And what procurement people are increasingly finding is, you can't outsource risk. You can blame suppliers, yeah, that's easy, it's great sport. But you can't actually outsource risk. It comes back to the buyer's desk ultimately. But these principles, and you can read them for yourself, cover human rights, labour management, the environment, and anti-corruption. The four great risks of CSR on the supply side of business as the UN see them. And what the Global Compact asks is to ask companies to embrace, support, and enact within their sphere of influence a set of core values in these areas in their supply chain. So proactively and hands-on manage these issues. And this is very demonstrably influencing professional buyers here and now in Melbourne right now. And I've stood in the office while I right-clicked this and pasted it into contracts saying the supplier will do all this and make sure the supply chain will as well. It's a lazy buyer's approach, of course. But the sentiment's there, if not the practicality. But no, wait, there's more. The Global Reporting Initiative is a similar initiative. And this is designed to improve the annual reports from companies. The third generation of the guidelines was signed up to by 60% of the ASX companies here in Australia. But there's the stat, 30% of all firms on the top 30 global stock exchanges in the world committed to Generation 3 of the Global Reporting Initiative guidelines. So that's why you've got 6 pages, yes, 6, not 5, not 7, 6 pages of beautiful colour photographs of all the fine works that the company does in their annual report, because they're signed up to the GRI guidelines. So they illustrate the fine work they do in corporate social responsibility and their standards and activities and successes in that area and their measures. And how we report on that is governed by the guidelines from GRI, G3. And then only a year or so ago, or 2 years ago now, 18 months ago, Generation 4 guidelines came out. I can hear you all thinking, oh, what's the difference between G4 and G3? G4 suggests that you do the same thing for your entire supply chain, not just your suppliers. Imagine that for a moment. As I say to procurement managers, you're about to get the memo from head office or the CEO's office saying, could you just let us have a memo back telling us that there's no slavery, corruption, poor labour practices or environmental risks in our supply chain? And we need it by Tuesday because we want to put that guarantee in the annual report next to the colour photograph of the little child in Africa that we've done so much to support. So could you just let us have that back by Tuesday? And procurement managers all over Australia are quivering because of course they can't write that memo because they don't know. And that will be the next frontier for procurement. You are buying better, faster, cheaper, cleaner, greener, safer, aren't you? Yes. How do you know? Becomes the question. Fair trade chocolate is the best example of this. But look at the effort they put in. A team of 12 people spent 2 years travelling the world to map 17 tiers in the supply chain between the little boy that picks cocoa plants in the Ivory Coast and the Cadbury's Fair Trade chocolate bar that Mr. Dutton has every lunchtime from the 7-Eleven, which, by the way, he pays 80 cents more for, so that little boy gets a living wage in the Ivory Coast, guaranteed by Fair Trade. Look at the effort to do one supply chain for one product. 17 tiers of the supply chain. A dozen people with an unlimited travel budget spending 2 years cleaning one. We've got thousands. A typical large company has 15,000 suppliers. I must move on because I promised we'd finish on time. The final area is pressure groups. And there are a number of pressure groups. I've already mentioned Supply Nation, but of course there's others, Twiggy's organisation, Walk Free being the most high profile. And then there's the most powerful pressure group, which is the consumer, the shopper. And as Hilary said, the oil shoppers are still buying green, given the choice, she went on to say, if other things are equal. And the big question for us today is when other things are not equal, will the oil shoppers still be buying green? Because what they're doing is assessing what is value. And I said at the start we'd finish up with the question, what is value? What is it to you? What is it to your organisation? Is it just a lower price? Is it lower cost? Is it lower risk? Is it better, faster, cheaper, greener, safer? What does it look like? Better, faster, cheaper, greener, safer? The maturity curve has taken on a different shape. Where do you stop your journey for your organisation? Or is it all of the above? How do you demonstrate that? What does value look like for your organisation? And when you define value, it comes from utility, it comes from cost, of course, it comes from managing risk and these new risks we've identified, but it also comes from other areas as well. Quality of service, and value also comes from innovation. New ideas that work, and there's innovation everywhere. And innovation, as procurement people find out, is often a prize of good SRM, supplier relationship management, and building great relationships with your supplier. It brings fruit. And what fruit can largely be dictated by the buyer to some degree. I really will finish up with a final point, which there's now a third dynamic, I think, to this holy trinity of wonderful supply side management. It's not just about CSR and sustainability, but about safety as well. And Rolf kindly played his part right at the beginning with a safety briefing, because 10 years ago, that would be unheard of, wouldn't it? When I came off the boat from England and walked straight into a meeting, actually, funnily enough, on Lonsdale Street, just next door, and got a safety briefing on the meeting we were about to have, I was giggling like a schoolboy. I thought that was a wind. I think I'm having a laugh. Hold the rail as I go down the steps. Oh, I can manage that. I thought it was a laugh. I was giggling. Not anymore. I won't go to a resources company meeting without a safety moment in my pocket. Absolutely not. They've changed the culture of business. And that's what we're talking about here. The culture is changing. Procurement's an instrument of policy. What is your policy? What a lot of people are talking about now is shared value. It's a very old term invented in 2011 by Michael Porter. And yes, Porter's Five Forces. Yes, that Michael Porter in Harvard Business Review. He talked about shared value. It's not about sharing the value we already have and even more evenly distributing it. It's not about that. It's about expanding the pool of value in economic and social terms. And this will be the new way, the new currency of business in the long run, he argues. He might be right, he might not be. But what he's saying is the purchase decision and the decision matrix that our decision-making unit within our organisation is working within is getting infinitely more complex. And there is much more choice on the side of the buyer in terms of how they make their purchase decision. Is it just price? Well, we've all evolved beyond that. We all know it isn't just price. So what is it? What does value look like? And there's a wide matrix of factors to consider in deciding what value looks like for your organisation. And I'd argue to you it's an extent to which you're aligned with what your organisation is trying to choose to do. In other words, can you draw a straight line between what you are doing every day behind your desk and what the organisation is trying to do? I did see a fabulous presentation in Singapore about 9 months ago by the Chief Procurement Officer globally of Kellogg's. I didn't know that Kellogg's only had 8 products. Breakfast cereals, of course. And what's the mission statement of Kellogg's? It's to make sure every family in the world has a good breakfast every morning. What a fantastic mission statement. And here was a chief procurement from a procurement department who could draw a straight line between what they were doing in procurement and how they achieved that. That's true alignment. And he made his purchase decisions based on how well they were helping support what the organisation was trying to do. A private company, no less. So shared value is perhaps the measure of the future. We'll see. But increasingly, all stakeholders seem to want more shared value. Certainly the ones sat in AGM saying we're prepared to give up a little bit of share price to have a cleaner conscience on our supply chain and have a stronger governance of it. Consumers seem to be saying the same thing, so do governments and certainly pressure groups, because everybody wants more. Thank you very much.